Hello. Hi, good evening. Hey.
time for your soca takeover with DJ Gel, getting you ready for Carnival. DJ Gel.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Midpoint from Bonn to Baku. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we examine the developments in international climate change negotiations, as well as how we can accelerate climate resilience for the Caribbean. As the name of the event says, we're at the midpoint between COP28 and COP29. And while climate action is not an event, these are important milestones where we can assess the progress that's being made and we can work together to increase ambition. So we're joined this afternoon, this evening, by the experts from Climate Analytics Caribbean who have just returned from the Bonn Climate Change Conference, and we'll be hearing their insights as they have been supporting small island states in their climate negotiations. So I hope you all are excited. I certainly am to get straight into tonight's discussions. I wouldn't say sit back and relax. I would say make yourself comfortable, but get ready to engage because we want this to be interactive. And throughout the discussion, we will pause to get questions from the audience. So take note of any questions you may have for our speakers. In addition to the climate analytics team, we'll also be joined by one of Trinidad and Tobago's leading journalists, Mr. Ryan Beatrieu, and youth climate leader, Mr. Riyad Mohammed. So we have a really enriching and empowering session prepared for you. So I look forward to your engagement. I'm just here to facilitate. Oh. And I think this might be a good point to introduce myself. I am Derval Barzey, the founder of the Climate Conscious podcast, and I'll be your host and moderator for this evening's event. So I want to jump straight in to today's session, starting with Ms. Ruana Haynes, the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean. Ruana is an international climate law and governance specialist and has participated in the UNFCCC for several years on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago. She has also been a lead negotiator for the Caribbean Community and the Alliance of Small Island States. So, Ruana, events like COP and SB60 are important for driving global climate action, fostering international cooperation, and holding countries accountable for their commitments to climate action. There were several key outcomes from COP28, including the completion of the first ever global stocktake. So, Rihanna, given your vast experience, can you give us an overview of the developments from COP28 to SB60 and also share with us a bit about the impact of the global stocktake?
Thanks so much, Derval, and good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming out. I see people coming in. Please feel free to sit anywhere you find a free seat. It's free seating. Thank you. So, yes, we are just back from the June Climate Conference. So for those of you who may not know, there are two major climate conferences happening every year. The COPs, which we've all heard about, that happen at the end of the year, as well as a June Climate Conference where parties follow up on what has been agreed at the COP. I don't think I need to convince anybody here that we are in an extremely critical moment when it comes to the impacts of climate change, the speed and the scale and the level of devastation that is already taking place as a result of global warming. What this means is that the global process that is set up for governments, for leaders to find solutions to these issues cannot fail. It must not fail. It must rise to the occasion. The process that established the Paris Agreement absolutely needs to deliver. Coming back from the session that just took place in June, I can say that at this point, it's not really delivering. So what's been happening? We've made some progress. We left COP28 last year with groundbreaking agreements in terms of loss and damage. We have the capitalization of a loss and damage fund that many of us, including myself, never thought they'd be alive to see happen. We have pledges for about $700 million in that fund. It sounds like a lot, it's petty change. Not all of it has been delivered as yet. But it was nevertheless an extremely important development. We also left COP28 with, for the first time ever, references to sectoral action that has to happen if we are serious about actually being able to mitigate climate change. So an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency, cut methane emissions that are all fueling global warming. And so we arrive at SB60 with some hope that we will in fact be putting ourselves in a position to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit for global warming that we've agreed in reach. We get to SB60 and parties are dialing back all of that, reinterpreting the agreements that were made, insisting on very political positions that are designed to ensure that there is little to no implementation of the decisions that we took last year. In parallel, we are in what we call a finance year. So the big item for COP29 is around this question of a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. And this is to replace the goal that we agreed in 2009 for the mobilization of $100 billion a year for climate change, a goal which we've never actually met, but we think we're going to meet it this year. So it's a big negotiation to come up with a new goal that will actually reflect the needs of developing countries for addressing climate change. Because the $100 billion goal was, for want of a better term, plucked from thin air in 2009, 2010. It was what was politically agreeable. It wasn't based on any rigorous analysis or understanding of what was actually going to be needed. And you will hear an update of what's happening in those discussions. What I will say is that absolutely nothing has been agreed to date. And we have to be ready to actually adopt some type of decision at this upcoming COP that sets out what this new goal is going to be, because that finance is what will support the implementation of the agreements that we took last year, notably in relation to a just transition. And you'll hear about the discussions that have been happening on the just transition as well. So my perspective is that overall, the tone, pace, and level of engagement from parties at the June Climate Conference is in sharp contrast to what is actually happening on the ground globally. And the recognition that our climate has already begun to irrevocably change, and that things will have to get worse before they get better. A number of political games are being played. Parties are pointing fingers, and it's all about, no, you go first, no, you, no, you, no, you, no, you. That's essentially what the discussion has been like across the board on finance, on mitigation, especially in relation to the transition. There has been some limited progress, but that progress does not go far or fast enough. And unfortunately, all of this is fueling a sense of despair around prospects for actually being able to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. And this despair is opening the discussion for false solutions and miracle technologies like solar radiation management, as well as an over-reliance on systems like carbon markets that might leave us worse off than we already are. So that's the synopsis, and I'll hand back over to Derval now for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Rana, for those sobering insights. As you said, the process has to work. However, it's not delivering. And it's very disheartening to hear that, parties are dialing back, as you said. But we have to, I guess, remain hopeful that we can, in fact, make an impact. So over to you, audience. Any questions for Ruana? Don't be shy. Yes.
Yeah.
Or it hasn't changed the trajectory of emissions, it hasn't changed, we are actually accelerating in terms of the number of emissions and stuff that's happening. Even if it is, and let's look at the last 12 months, it is the hottest 12 months we have ever had, right? And we've already breached 1.5, albeit maybe temporarily, but yeah, right? But so it's likely to go back down, but when we look at it, it's very likely by 2050 we will hit 1.5, right? So the question is what is the purpose of having all these COP conferences still, right? Because it seems then that all the deliberation and talk is actually not doing anything, right? Because if we are to look purely at results of hitting carbon emissions or anything like that, we haven't been doing anything. So
that's the question?
Question is, what's the purpose? But
okay.
why continuing then having all these particular meetings? I mean, yes, the question will then be what otherwise, but if it is that's not producing results, then why continue this at this point?
Okay, thanks for the question, Sachin. And I think it's a valid question, and it's one that I ask myself constantly, having been involved in these discussions for the better part of 15 years. A few things. The global climate process has bent the emissions curve. It's not true to say that it hasn't. It has significantly bent the emissions curve. Before the Paris Agreement, we were on a trajectory for increases in global temperatures of up to 4 degrees and more. Since the Paris Agreement, the first round, the second round of NDCs, that trajectory has now bent significantly down to about 2.4. In the most optimistic scenario, it's about 1.8 degrees Celsius. But that optimistic scenario is about a 60% chance, and it really depends on governments actually doing what they said they were going to do, and also implementing at the upper range of their ambitions. But the curve has significantly bent. The second thing is we are not yet at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Globally, on average, we're at 1.3 degrees Celsius, so we're very close. It is very likely that we will exceed the 1.5 degrees limit by 2050. At this point, though, the focus needs to be on accelerating action so that even if we do hit that limit, we can quickly come back down. Because any amount of overshoot is going to give rise to cascading impacts. And the longer we overshoot, the worse the impacts will be. So those two things. In terms of the utility of the process, I will say that the process is what we have. Now, I know that's a deeply unsatisfactory answer. I'm well aware that it's a deeply unsatisfactory answer. There have been a number of other initiatives, and there continue to be a number of alternative paths that are being pursued. So, for example, there's a proposal now for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that has the support of some few states, but not all states. And I think will never have the support of all states for obvious reasons. There are all the court matters being brought before international as well as domestic tribunals. So we have the ICJ matter, we have the matter brought before the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea as well, and we have a human rights matter that was brought before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And all of these are extremely valuable initiatives. In fact, the ITLOS findings by the judges set out that two important findings. One, carbon dioxide is now considered a pollutant under United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And so any state can be brought before ITLOS for emitting too much carbon dioxide to be absorbed into the oceans, which is causing warming and acidification and the destruction of coral reef environments. And two, that all states parties to the Paris Agreement are obligated to put forward their highest level of emission in the context of their nationally determined contributions that are submitted under the Paris Agreement that set out the actions that they intend to take to address climate action. So even in the context of the alternative routes, they still have to come back to the framework that's established under the UN Convention on Climate Change and by the Paris Agreement, because that, as flawed as it is, as slow as it is what we have. So that's the best answer I could give you right now.
Hi, good day. I'm Bradley Bihari. Not familiar with this thing. I'm a medical student, so I just joined my partner here to see what's this about and everything.
Thanks for coming.
My question is, what is your expected outcomes from this COP meeting, and what you expect the positive outcomes from this, and what you think should be implemented to reach those goals?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And Some of that is going to be addressed by Carlin and Sasha in terms of some of the specific subject areas that we're looking at. Essentially, from this COP, we expect to have a new global goal for climate finance, a new figure to replace the 100 billion. And as we all know, money talks. A couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Energy was speaking about the transition and what it means. And his basic question was, but who is going to pay for that? Right? And you can be sure that in many countries, even countries where the main economic sector is not oil and gas, that is also the question. Where is the money? Who is going to pay for this? Especially for countries that have not caused the problem, right? But countries that are on the front lines of the actual impacts. So the main outcome that we expect from this COP is around that new finance target. There are a lot of arguments that you'll hear about in one of the presentations to come around that discussion. It's a very difficult discussion. Who has to pay? Who gets this money? What else do we need? All sorts of things, as you might imagine. So it's one of the most difficult discussions we've ever had in the process. But there's also a number of other outcomes that we expect from this year. We expect to make progress on parties implementing the global stocktake outcome. And that's around this notion of a global transition away from fossil fuels, global tripling of renewable energy, doubling of energy efficiency, reduction of methane by 2030. So we expect to see evidence of that being brought forward by this COP. And it is critically important because without that, then we are in an even worse situation than we would have been in last year. And we don't need for that to happen. We also expect this year for there to be progress made in setting up the rules for how the carbon markets that are agreed under the Paris Agreement will operate. Now, I am not convinced around the utility or necessity of carbon markets, but it is a part of the framework that was agreed. There were many countries who were of the view that we couldn't have a global climate agreement without something in it to incentivize the private sector to actually invest in renewable technologies, for example. And so carbon markets are being looked at as one, an innovative source of financing, and two, an opportunity to accelerate the transition by promoting private sector buy-in. But it only works if we get the rules right. And right now, there's a huge debate around those rules, around what has to be reported, around what can be counted towards an actual reduction in emissions. And there are a lot of countries that want the maximum flexibility possible, which is going to result in a situation where we set up a market without environmental integrity and we undermine every other goal that we've set. So there's a lot of political attention that's going to come to bear this year at the COP, including in relation to carbon markets. So it's finance, it's mitigation action around GST implementation, carbon markets, and you'll hear about some of the others soon.
Thanks, Ruana. And moving along with the conversation, we'll come back to questions shortly, but I want us to keep with the conversation, and I want us to switch gears to Mr. Carlin Mendoza, who's the climate policy advisor at Climate Analytics Caribbean, and he has served as the legal counsel for the Belize Tourism Board, as well as the post of magistrate with the judiciary of Belize. His work currently focuses on climate change law and policy, disaster law, and disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean. So, Carlin, the UAE Just Transition Work Program was announced at the last COP, and this initiative aims to ensure that the transition away from fossil fuels towards a low carbon economy is fair and inclusive. So at the Bonn Summit, you were supporting small island states in their just transition negotiations. So how have these progressed since COP28, and what is the outlook for COP29?
Thanks, Derval, for the question, and good evening. Yeah, you hear me? All right, good. So, keeping this as casual and as brief and as exciting as possible, just giving you a quick overview of what we talk about in terms of when we speak about just transition. You would have heard the term. A lot of people associate it with the transition of the workforce for people who are in that area in terms of mitigation effort and that transition from high carbon to low carbon and the impact of that transition on the workforce particularly. And this was originated from way beyond the Paris Agreement in terms of the International Labour Organization and other trade unions and activists that mentioned this principle or concept of just transition. And what we've seen within the climate space, that reference to just transition has been made in terms of the workforce within the Paris Agreement and the preamble. But this UAE Just Transition Work Program that was decided at COP28 seeks to extend the conversation outside of the workforce and into the socioeconomic impacts of the transition on peoples, on communities, and livelihoods in particular. And it seeks to channel the conversation away from just focusing on the energy transition, because as Rana indicated, the conversation or the talk is that we are the ones who are feeling the impacts the most, where we have caused or done the least amount to contribute to the impacts. So we, small island developing states, may not be large emitters, but we have other industries and other service areas which will be impacted within this transition. So that is just an overall overview of the Just Transition and the Just Transition Work Program. So what we have discussed from COP28 with the establishment of that work program to now, to Bonn, is the formulation of exactly what is to be discussed or entailed within the discussions. So the Just Transition Work Program is made up of a series of dialogues that will be held twice a year. And these dialogues will seek to, well, the topics of these dialogues are selected or recommended by parties. There's an opportunity for countries and non-party stakeholders to submit exactly what we want to discuss or what we see this Just Transition Work Program detailing. And this year in particular, the discussion was on the just transition and the impacts of the nationally determined contributions and how we are going to use just transition principles in defining our new NDC contributions in the next round. And within those discussions, what we noted, particularly for small island developing states, is the need for socioeconomic assessments and modeling in terms of, as I indicated, the transition will affect, we know, workforce of persons within that sort of oil and gas industry. However, what about the persons who are as we indicated, the persons who cook food and provide lunch for those workers, the fishermen, the persons who rent homes or build homes or construct. So what we have to look at is how does this transition impact all persons within our sphere. So that was some of the discussions that came out of this work program. And what it is that it gives us opportunity as Caribbean SIDS and overall SIDS from Caribbean and Pacific. It gives us an opportunity to channel these discussions away from the mitigation approach, away from just saying that we have to deal with response measures, which is the impact on the workforce, but we now have to take an overall collective view. And how does this transition affect adaptation, or how does loss and damage come into play when we speak about just transition? And it now gives us an opportunity to integrate these principles into the discussions. So I'll leave it at that for now and take any questions with respect to the work program. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. And it's important that you mentioned the way that climate change is affecting so many aspects of our society. We often see that climate change is intersectional. So it's important that we take a very broad and inclusive look at climate change, especially climate action, ensuring that, all groups, especially marginalized, underrepresented groups, are included in these conversations and have access to decision-making spaces. That's very important. So we can take 2 brief questions for Colin. I guess while the audience is thinking, do we have a hand? Okay, great.
Just trying to get it programmed. But I'll ask Carla a question. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Taleh Mohammed, all things climate. The question I have to ask with regard, because you mentioned, it's important that reskilling, retooling, education is such an important part to play in this. We have a strong oil and gas sector, and even some of that same workforce could transition into renewable sector. And even when it comes to simple things we use, like air conditioning units and solar water heaters, how is that being discussed in terms of the workforce be educated and upskilled to meet the demand of the just transition? Or has that been discussed as well?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. So as I said, there's an opportunity to make submissions, and parties, and when we talk about parties, I'm sure parties means countries in this case, and then non-party stakeholders means all others who have a voice at the table, including civil society and these non-governmental organizations. So within that, I could specifically speak for AOSIS. We have made submissions in terms of an area to be discussed. Sorry. The Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, the acronyms will fly over my head even. So within that space, we have made a submission with respect to that same, the educational requirements of a transition. And hopefully within the 3 years of this work program, there will be an opportunity to discuss that. And out of these discussions, there is a summary report that the the Climate Change Secretariat produces. And within that report, we'll be able to get some key insights as to now, how do we translate these insights, these decisions, these tools, and these practices to our domestic fabric. That's what we're doing here. We're there at that international level, negotiating, understanding, learning, and now being able to translate those learnings into real practice. Thanks.
Good evening. Hello? Chandel. All right, we got this. Hi, Chandel. Neil, you touched on my question already, so I'm gonna just kind of, what are we gonna do to make sure like the just transition is permeated through our national policy and all those other things that we have coming around it? Like the NDCs are going to be updated for 2025. So how are we going to break down these silos and make sure that, we leave no one behind, because we're coming out with these policies that don't necessarily work with the just transition program. So what are we doing to, make this more copacetic locally? Thanks.
An excellent question. Not sure if I am versed to respond particularly in terms of what we have to do. What I can say is that from these learnings, let's speak locally. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a draft just transition policy and implementation policy. We all know how cabinet and and these procedures work. And as I indicated, the discussions at this first dialogue was to deal with the implementation of just transition principles into NDCs, so that it sort of gives countries that insight in terms of how do we consider other sectors outside of energy within the NDC development. So we can only hope and be hopeful that when we do get these decisions from the UN process, that they are taken on board through our policy and through our legislation. That's the hope that we can all aspire and really wish happens. But I think that beyond that, it can go towards how we, I guess, within our jobs, because as I said, the just transition is something that's socioeconomic and applies to everyone and even businesses, communities, etc. So it's something that we have to now see how we could find a way to infiltrate those principles within our domestic fabric outside of the government. So something to think about, something we can come up and brainstorm as members of society and civil society being that. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. And as you said, we may not have all the concrete answers here today, but it's important that we start thinking about how we can integrate climate action and especially just transition into the work that we do and making it practical. As Talia mentioned, workforce transformation, that's important for us, especially in Trinidad and Tobago as an oil and gas-based economy for over 100 years of at least oil production. How do we make that shift? And it's a shift that we have to make. So conversations like these are so important. So moving along, and I must thank you, Colin, for your insights. And now we will get into another hot topic, which is loss and damage. And I'm excited to hear from Ms. Sasha Jatansing, loss and damage expert at Climate Analytics Caribbean. Sasha is a climate finance and participatory environmental governance professional with over 13 years of experience in public, international development, and civil society sectors in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. So Sasha, COP28 started with a bang, with a historic agreement to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund to provide financial support to vulnerable countries impacted by climate impacts. And parties also agreed on a framework for the global goal on adaptation, setting targets to enhance climate resilience. So coming out of Bonn, what can you tell us about the developments with loss and damage specifically, and also negotiations for adaptation?
Thanks, Derval, and good evening, everyone. So for loss and damage and adaptation, I could say there were glimmers of hope at the Bonn Climate Conference. So there is some hope coming out of the negotiations, particularly for, I would say, adaptation, which has, I would say traditionally and historically been, undervalued and underfinanced and really and truly underappreciated. The focus has always been on mitigation and really not on the importance of adaptation, particularly for vulnerable countries like small island developing states and least developed countries. And at COP28 last year in Dubai, we had a major breakthrough in the adaptation negotiations where a framework for the global goal on adaptation was established, and that's the UAE framework on climate resilience. And that's quite important because under the Paris Agreement, under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, we've established a global goal on adaptation, which focuses on enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. However, I'm counting, for about 8 years, not much work happened. There was very little progress on adaptation on the GGA. And then at COP28, when we finally got this framework for the GGA, the UAE framework for climate resilience, that really showed the importance of adaptation. And why that's necessary is because this framework allows us to track the progress of adaptation action at a global level, right? It's no longer, adaptation happening in silos, happening at, local levels, and so on. Now it's been elevated to the, I would say, to that sort of forum that goes along with mitigation and also loss and damage. And what's quite important to note is that loss and damage and adaptation are inextricably linked. There is this, I would say, spectrum, for adaptation and adaptation action that will, and lack of adaptation action that could result in loss and damage due to insufficient or no mitigation or adaptation action. So you can't talk about loss and damage alone, and I will always advocate for this. We have to always consider adaptation as well. It's like our first line of defense, especially for, highly vulnerable SIDS. And at SB 60, on the very last day of the conference, after spending, we basically were kicked out of the World Conference Center the night before because negotiations on the GGA framework was still happening, right? And on the very last day, we finally had an agreement on how we were going to operationalize the GGA work program for development of GGA indicators, which was established at COP28. In addition to the GGA framework, there was a work program, the UAE BELAM work program on GGA indicators. And this is incredibly important because this is now where we're able to devise suitable, globally applicable indicators for the 7 thematic areas that covers adaptation. So now we're able to track the progress, how much is happening, and then also what else do we need, if it's finance, if it's capacity building and so on, to meet that goal. And I think that's quite important for us. So now this work program, it can finally commence, and it's technical work, but it's so incredibly necessary for the type of work and progress on adaptation that needs to happen globally. And then also in terms of loss and damage, I mean, there was a lot of, I would say, action happening at COP28 with the operationalization of the loss and damage fund that happened on the first day, capitalization of the fund to about 700 million US, which, as Rana said, sounds like a lot, but let's put it in context. So when Hurricane Maria, devastated Dominica in 2017, the costs, the losses and damages, those costs were in the order of about 1.4 billion US for that single climate event. So and that's one country, and that's one extreme loss and damage event. So you could definitely see the scale of loss and damage finance is woefully insufficient. That's right now being that the loss and damage fund currently has. We definitely need significantly more money towards loss and damage finance. But regardless, we've had progress that's been operationalized, and also the board of the loss and damage fund was established, where we have board members represented by three Caribbean states. We have the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, and Barbados represented on the Loss and Damage Fund Board, which I think is fantastic to ensure that Caribbean voices and Caribbean needs are properly represented at, for this board. And, okay, so I would say why this board is quite important is because it has this, I would say, gargantuan task this year to devise what are the operations, what are the governance structures, what are the access criteria and eligibility criteria for who can access the Loss and Damage Fund. And those recommendations will be sent to COP29 at the end of this year to be agreed by parties. So far, the board has met once, and they have their second meeting happening, I think it's the 9th to the 12th of July. So you see, they have, I would say, a huge undertaking to do within this year. And another big, I would say, takeaway out of, happening around SB 60 is that the World Bank, they confirmed that they will be the interim host of the Secretariat of the Loss and Damage Fund Board, as well as the trustee of the fund for 4 years, which I would say is great because that allows the fund to be well on its way to being operationalized. So in terms of the various updates and activities on loss and damage, you see that there has been a lot of progress, a lot more technical progress taking place, but it's all leading up to agreements happening at COP29. And I mean, I just want to touch on, and Rana and Colin mentioned this, the importance of finance, because we are in our finance year with the NCQG being negotiated. The new collective quantified goal on climate finance, it's a mouthful, so it's easier to say NCQG, but it's just important to note that that we have to note that the battle on finance, especially adaptation and loss and damage finance, is going to be in the NCQG negotiations. And it's important to note that the Alliance of Small Island States and Least Developed Countries, they're both advocating for the NCQG to include distinct and quantifiable sub-goals for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And that's quite important because, the current definition we still don't have an official definition of climate finance, but that definition only includes mitigation and adaptation. So loss and damage finance is separate, right? So it's important to understand that the different pillars of climate action, which is mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage action, we need to be able to finance that adequately. And we need to ensure that we have the global climate negotiations being able to adequately address that. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Sasha. Just one note, anyone driving PDG, a Kia, PDG, and PCS, a Toyota vehicle, could you kindly move your vehicles so that the owner can have access, please? PDG, a Kia vehicle, and PCS, a Toyota. Thank you. So thank you, Sasha, for putting adaptation and loss and damage into context for us and also giving us some hope. I mean, Ruana started things off on a kind of note, but you brought some hope into the discussion so that we could note that progress is being made. I think we have established that the COP process, the Paris Agreement, is not perfect, but it's what we have, and we have managed to make some progress, but what we need now is accelerated action and accelerated ambition. So at this point, we can take one or two short questions for Sasha. Any takers? Yes.
So I'm not familiar with loss and damage too much. So I wanted to know, what is the role of developed countries in this whole work program that you all have sort of come to in the SBs? And also, what is going to happen? I guess this is a broader question, in terms of what is going to happen like between now as the Bonn conference is finished and, in the run up to COP29, like what are the sort of preparations or discussions that are going to be had to sort of help us bring us closer to those goals that we want to have at COP29? Yeah.
Thanks for that, and that's a good question. So in terms of the work program, that's the UAE Belém work program for the indicator development for the global goal on adaptation. And right now, we have a lot of work ahead of us. So what's going to start, the work has already started with a bang in that now there'll be mapping and compilation of existing indicators that countries utilize to track adaptation progress in the various thematic areas on health, water, food, and so on. Those are thematic areas under the GG framework that was agreed. And then also we'll have workshops as well, and then have a technical expert group meet to discuss and to finalize the GG indicators, because the hope is that those indicators will be agreed at COP30 in Brazil. However, at COP29, what parties want is that we want to know what exists right now and what further work do we have to do. So it's basically doing a stock take, and for us to know how to move forward, and noting that we have now 18 months of a 2-year work program to get very technical work done. And in terms of loss and damage, I think, as I said, the loss and damage board is right now doing very critical work, deciding on, the policies and the procedures and the governance structure and so on, and also the I would say the access and eligibility criteria for countries and so on to be able to access the fund. And all of that will be forwarded, those recommendations and those proposals will be forwarded to COP29 for parties to agree. And once that happens, then the loss and damage fund is ready for business. So they have a huge task ahead of them. And I think they're well on their way to doing that. And in terms of the role of developed countries, I still am not sure. So developed countries are involved in the negotiations. All countries are involved. What it is, as with negotiations, there is a lot of compromise. And what we've found, and especially for the negotiations for the GG indicators, developed countries, basically, they don't want indicators because they don't want to measure progress. They don't want to have any indicators that track, adaptation, finance, and so on. They don't want to do that. So that's where you have that pushback. But what we've seen is when developing countries come together, the entire of the group of 77 and China come together, they are a huge force to advocate and to push for these critical issues at least in adaptation, and I could speak to that. And then also you have partners from other, like developing countries, maybe the European Union and so on, who view adaptation as highly important as well. And they're able to advocate and change the negotiating positions for other developing countries. So I would say it's how you can meet at this compromise and how you could work on collaboration to get that sort of the best option for all, which is not perfect, but we have to work with what we have under this I would say climate change global negotiation architecture.
Before we move to the next question, could the driver of a PCA Honda move their vehicle, please? PCA. Parked Anyone packed outside of bread basket? Thank you. Talia, you had a question?
Yeah, so my question kind of got answered a little bit by what Sasha was talking about in terms of the ensuring that the global goal for adaptation. My concern, and I don't think it's a concern that's without realistic fear, because we are talking about getting finance together to support loss and damage and the global south. Now we have all these terms now: global south, global north, annex 1, annex 2 countries, developing countries, developed countries, and the inequality of burden. So my question really is for the entire team or anybody who wants to give it a go with regard to what else is being negotiated while this negotiation is happening. It's good to hear that the World Bank is a trustee. Who else is going to be supporting the non-politicization of the fund? Just in Trinidad and Tobago alone, we have a green fund that is inaccessible. Who is going to make sure that those who could access the fund can access it? Are those rules and guidelines also being drawn up? Is it at countries that, because all of these also are voluntary, the NDCs are voluntary, the national adaptation plans are voluntary. I know Climate Analytics is doing a lot of work regionally to support the national adaptation plans and a method and approach for that with CARICOM. But who is going, or is that also being discussed? How are we also going to manage this fund to ensure there's equity? And that should be done in tandem. And with that, the regulation of the fund by each country when they do access, when the governments and states access it first, who is going to also oversee that?
So essentially, how we operationalize and implement the loss and damage fund?
And have enough rules and systems with learnings of things that have gone wrong in the past.
Okay. Who would like to take this one?
So thanks for that, Talia. And in terms of that's why I said right now the board has a really difficult, momentous task, because the rules and procedures and then access requirements and so on, that's quite important, because you want to ensure that they have learnings, as you said, of what happened before, with the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, also the Global Environment Facility as well. And what countries, what parties and so on would, I would say, non-state actors and so on have done before when the loss and damage fund was being operationalized. The transitional committee was tasked with doing that. There were lots of submissions and inputs from countries, from non-state actions, but from funds, civil society and so on, to really highlight how this fund should work and how it should benefit those who most need it. And that's what the board members have been utilizing in their development. And just to note that the Loss and Damage Fund Board is independent. It's an independent entity from the World Bank. So they have their own governance structures, procedures and operations and so on. So it's separate and apart from the World Bank. The World Bank is just facilitating it as it's a financial intermediary fund under the World Bank for the first 4 years while the fund gets set up. And that's been, the World Bank has had experience doing these sorts of things before. So it's not something entirely new. It's a best practice. But I think the Alliance of Small Island States and so on really advocated for the board to be independent, to ensure that, the oversight and the rules and procedures that would govern the fund and govern allocations and so on would be independent of the World Bank and would ensure that it was a fit for purpose and responsive fund that addresses loss and damage needs. So I hope that helps.
Maybe I'll just add to that, and I see your question, see your hand, Christian. A lot of the questions that you asked were heavily debated when the fund was being set up. It was a big discussion. There was a huge discussion around the modalities. Are we going to do better than what is already there? How are we going to address some of the shortfalls, in particular with the Green Climate Fund, especially around access, especially around, you know, the application periods, the fact that it takes sometimes 2 years before you hear back and then you hear a no after small countries have dedicated so much time and so much resources trying to access this funding. So all of that was heavily debated, even coming down to the very, very, very last minute before COP28. It was a near thing that we made it to COP28 with the fund established, because there was a huge falling out between developed and developing countries around these issues, and precisely the role of equity, you know, precisely the role of the World Bank in particular. For developed countries, of course, they want to see an established institution that they trust dealing with their money. For developing countries, the World Bank is a part of the problem when it comes to accessing climate finance, right? So it was a huge debate. It's still ongoing. They have made some progress, as Sasha has said, but there's still a lot that the board has to do, and that's why there was a lot of maneuvering around who would be on that board. There's still a lot of work that the board has to do to ensure that once money starts being dispersed, that all of these concerns have been addressed.
Christian?
I got my question now. I just want to get in quick before we move on, because I know we have more to do. The NCQJ is meant to redefine obligations to climate finance, right? It will replace the $100 billion that was agreed upon in 2009, which is not enough. It was an arbitrary number, and we want a number that more reflects the current needs of developing countries. If the $100 billion goal could not be met in time, what kind of obligations could we possibly put into the NCQJ to ensure that we meet the goal that is agreed upon?
I mean, that's what the $100 billion question. So there's a lot around the NCQG, New Collective Quantified Goal on Finance, that is being discussed aside from the quantum. The quantum is perhaps the most important bit, the most visible bit of it, the bit of it that if we don't get it done, then we haven't done what we're supposed to do. But there are lots of other issues that come along with that to address exactly what you said. So there are different proposals on the table. Sasha referenced the proposal from AOSIS that sets out that we need to have a goal that's streamed in certain areas. So we need to have sub-goals to ensure accountability, right? This was not a feature of the 100 billion goal process at all, which is part of what has contributed to us really never understanding whether we were meeting that goal and ultimately not meeting that goal for several years. So there are a lot of proposals that have been put forward to ensure that this particular goal, one, is responsive to needs, two, can be tracked, there is more transparency and accountability around the money that is being delivered, where, how, to whom. There is a discussion as well around this question of a definition for climate finance in order to help with this question of accountability, but there's a lot of pushback on that. Developed countries are of the view that any finance that they give to countries, even for war, could be counted as climate finance. So they are not interested in having that definition of climate finance be part of the discussion. So that's also contributing to the lack of progress. So developing countries have now been saying, well, let's discuss this issue of transparency as a bit of a workaround. So we're not having the definition discussion full on because there's no desire to do that. But we'll talk about accountability, we'll talk about transparency. So they're still trying to work out the building blocks that would go alongside or work alongside the quantum in order to ensure that we're actually departing from the situation that we were in before. But what I will say is that a lot of the to and fro-in and backing and forthing is around, I would say, a desire to basically repeat exactly what was done in the past, except have more contributors from amongst developing countries and less recipients. And so that's one approach that's being advocated primarily by developed countries. And then there's a developing country approach where, okay, we need a quantum that responds to needs. We need more accountability around tracking how this is being delivered. And we need, lots of other arrangements to ensure that we're not doing the same thing again, right? Hoping to get different results. And it's very difficult to see how we will make our way through that discussion to a final outcome, but I think we will definitely have an outcome this year. It may not be an outcome that anybody likes, but there will be one.
Thanks, Ruana. And as we can see, climate finance is always a major factor because it's an important enabler for climate action that we so desperately need. And we've been hearing that we're in a finance year. So at this point, we have a video update on finance from Her Excellency Dr. Janine Felson, Ambassador of Belize, an Ocean and Climate Change Advisor for CARICOM and AOSIS, and the inaugural head of the Indo-Pacific Climate Hub of Australia. So please turn your attention to the screens.
Taken in COP29 will be a decision to set a new climate finance goal for what is known as the NCQG. Over the past 2 years, NCQG deliberations have taken the form of dialogue. It was not until last year in July that parties agreed to switch to the negotiation mode. In Bonn, for the first time, parties began looking at texts that contain various elements that have been discussed in relation to quantum, temporal scope, material scope, quality, access, and transparency for the new goal. While there were several iterations of text, at the end of the day, what was produced by the presiding officers did not provide any clear options, despite the fact that the parties have fundamentally different bases for their preferred elements. Developing countries, for instance, have based their consideration on the implementation of the Paris Agreement as a whole, while developed countries are focused on the implementation of a singular element of the Paris Agreement relating to the mobilization of finance. As a result, developing countries have articulated a preference for a deliverable climate finance goal, while developed countries prefer a collective mobilization goal, or in other words, an aspirational target. These differences are definitive of distinctly different options, but they are not the options that necessarily suit our current context. For small island developing states, those potential options risk marginalizing our interests. So the Alliance of Small Island States have therefore put forward a proposal for decision on a climate finance goal which addresses the particular circumstances of small island developing states in accessing concessional financing at scale to implement transformative action and having regard for debt sustainability. AOSIS has called for this proposal to be a distinct option for parties to consider. This will be an important next step. On the political side, we need to ensure that our voices, as particularly vulnerable countries, least contributors to climate change, but worse off for loss and damage, are heard. We need strong political backing. This is a critical decade for climate action. The aim of the Climate Finance School is to help us step up our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with 1.5, to increase our defenses and responses to climate impacts, and to support our people and our economies in a just transition. The finance goal can make a difference for our long-term sustainability. The new finance goal must provide for the predictability of finance, adequacy and scale of finance, and the necessary urgency in delivery, because we simply cannot wait. It is imperative for the Caribbean region, therefore, that the finance goal fits the ambition of the Paris Agreement to keep 1.5 within reach, which is an immutable safeguard for vulnerable countries like the Caribbean and small island developing states.
And we thank Ambassador Felson for that update. She continues to be a stalwart climate champion. And unfortunately, she could not be with us this evening, but we do have an opportunity if there are any more finance-related questions that you want to pose to the panel before we shift gears a bit. Rana, I know that even the global stocktake process highlighted the need for more finance to flow towards climate action. Anything else you'd like to share at this point? Okay. So as we transition to the next segment, please join me in thanking Carlin and Sasha for their contribution. And we'll now invite Mr. Ryan Bechu and Mr. Riyad Mohammed to join us on stage. So many of you may know Ryan as the lead editor, News Gathering for Guardian Media Limited. He's covered a range of topics, including politics, sports, and climate change. His work in climate change started in 2021 during COP26, and he has attended COP27 in Egypt and COP28 in Dubai. So Ryan, from the perspective of media, what are some of the key messages that are very pressing for the Caribbean? And how can we leverage the media to advance climate action ahead of COP29?
All right, thanks very much for having me, Derval, and good evening to everyone. I think a lot of what was discussed in the first session ties back into what the media should be talking about midway to COP29. Top of our tongues would be climate finance. The media itself has a huge role to push that particular agenda. I often see comments about, this is small island states, not just here in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific as well. You always see these commentaries about these small island states wanting money from developed nations. Why don't you go find the cash yourself? We can't. All right, we don't have the capacity, we're not that developed, and we're being adversely affected. So I think the messaging that you use a very key word, the messaging from the media, midway point from now on headed to Baku, has to center around things like climate finance, the loss and damage fund, which Sasha explained so brilliantly. Those things are key for us. And that's one of the things that I try to, when I speak about climate journalism, that's one of the things that I try to get across to people who are covering. The climate change world is so highly technical and it's so large, right, that you could get lost in it. It has to always encompass what is key for us here in the Caribbean. What do we want to get? We don't have coal to study about. Coal doesn't matter to us. That's an India problem. That's a Europe problem, right? But, you know, the loss and damage fund, because we're having such severe impacts on us small island states here in the Caribbean, loss and damage fund, that's very important to us. So we need to get our messaging right when it comes to the loss and damage fund. Access to climate finance. Is the World Bank, you know, trustworthy enough for small island states like us to go to? You know, that's the conversations that we should be having as journalists, climate journalists, and as a media fraternity midway point to COP and headed to Baku over the next few months. I hope that made sense.
It does. Thank you, Ryan. And in addition to what you mentioned, what comes to mind in terms of the role of media is also holding our leaders accountable. And how have you seen the media play that role, and have you experienced any challenges in terms of holding our leaders, local, regional, even international, accountable to these urgently needed climate commitments?
So I want to answer that question with two sides to the very same coin. One of it, yes, it's holding politicians and leaders and negotiators who go to these climate conferences and make pledges. Yes, it's absolutely holding them to account. And there are a lot of challenges, particularly here in an oil and gas-based country like Trinidad and Tobago, where you hear the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries talk about energy transition, but you never really see movement towards that energy transition. So yes, there are really big challenges when it comes to having a draft just transition policy for so many years, but you could never really see it over the line. We need to keep asking those questions. What I do want to also add, though, which I think is often forgotten, it's not just a politician's thing. It's not just a government thing. It's not just holding a government to account wherever you go. And when you go globally, sometimes the challenges could get much bigger when you talk about the lobbying industry, the oil and gas industry. Because sometimes you may be, right here in Trinidad and Tobago, you may be lucky as a journalist that the government doesn't take you on if you ask hard questions. But BP might. Shell might. And it's not only that they take you on, what they try to do is they take you down. So they send you a pre-action protocol letter, right, to stifle you or to gag you. And out of that pre-action protocol letter, they hope that you and your company don't have enough money to fight back, and so you stop publishing. So it's a little bit more than just government. It's a little bit more than just politics. In fact, I would venture to say it's a lot more, because when you have these huge oil and gas industries, Exxon in Guyana, they really have not only the might, but they have the finances to try to shut you down.
Thanks for giving us that broad view of, the challenges that you face. But we definitely commend you and encourage you to continue the work that you're doing in the media. And just before we bring Riyadh into the conversation, I want to ask you, I think you're almost a COP veteran by now. What are your expectations realistically for COP 29?
So here's why I would like to answer your question, but I might not by the end of this statement. And I hope that you're not upset with this answer. What I want to, and this is particularly me speaking broadly to the audience here. As a journalist, I think it's important that everybody in the room understands, or come to understand by the end of this statement, that there is a difference between a climate journalist and a climate activist. I don't try to be the latter, because I'm not. Not that I'm saying that I'll never be. Not that I'm saying that I deny climate change. Not that I'm saying that I don't believe that the climate is changing. But I'm a climate journalist. And covering climate journalism means that I give BP a voice, but also Ruana a voice. And there's a clear line of demarcation of being balanced. The Loss and Damage Fund was on the opening morning of the COP28 in Dubai. Even as a climate journalist, that was almost like a World Cup moment. To see that something that people even before you were born kind of were championing and hoping for, talking to Prime Minister Gaston Brown at COP27, and he was so passionate about it. And then over the next few months, covering climate change, talking to Ruana before since 4, and you realize, you know, we had this crowning moment in Dubai at COP28, and then it sort of just went cold. I'm hoping, really hoping that the fund, the tools of the fund, all of the intricacies and the details at COP29 from a Caribbean standpoint, I'm really hoping that we could get somewhere with it. I know it's a finance COP. I'm really hoping that there is some news that can come out of COP29 in Azerbaijan, that small island states that are really facing the brunt of the climate change can have some good news to go into the next year with, particularly with climate finance and loss and damage.
Yes, I think we're all hoping for stronger action as we head to COP29. So I'm very excited to welcome Mr. Riyad Mohammed, Environmental Education Officer attached to the Public Education Unit at the Environmental Management Authority. Riyad works closely with the Action for Climate Empowerment, ACE, focal points to fulfill Trinidad and Tobago's obligation under the UNFCCC ACE Glasgow Work Programme. So Riyad, youth are important stakeholders in climate action, and youth have been very vocal in demanding stronger action, and they continue to bring creative and innovative approaches to climate advocacy and activism and action on a whole. So what are your thoughts on the state of global climate change development, and how can we really build momentum and accelerate action for the Caribbean?
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I agree. Youth is, if not the most important stakeholder, definitely up there. And as a youth, sometimes I feel like we are highly tokenized. You know, it's important that we attend these things so that they could tick a checkbox. And that's unfortunate because I think now that we have a much higher proportion of youth that are so brave and so willing to speak out and stand up. And that's something that we really need to take advantage of in the best way possible. We speak about futures. We speak about what could happen 2050, 2060, 2070, 2100. And what we fail to realize is that this current generation of youth and the future generations are the ones that are going to be smack dead in the middle of this climate or triple planetary crisis. And this is why they need to be given a voice. I'll just speak briefly about my experience at the SITS conference, which was, by the way, my first international conference. It was interesting because after the third side event, I realized very quickly that it's just all about talk. And I heard the same thing for about an hour, back to back. And as a youth and as somebody that really wants to see change, that's not very hopeful. Because then I think to myself, if we do everything perfectly in Trinidad and Tobago, if we are 100%, if we have 100% renewable energy, if we have all the environmentally sustainable behaviors embedded in our culture and our society, we're still going to be affected by climate change, right? So it's a little disheartening, but sometimes you just have to keep going. And I mean, I looked at Sasha's expression and I was like, oh, okay, she has a positive look on her face, so maybe there's something we could look forward to. But yeah, I really feel like, you know, as one island, if you stand up, it's noble, it's brave. But together, it's powerful if we come together. And I think that there's a need for joint advocacy across the islands. I remember meeting other environmental educators, and I felt this spark. I was like, oh, okay, I could just keep going. We could just keep doing things, make the projects that we are doing locally something regional, and then maybe something international. And well, I come from that education background, that education standpoint, and I believe that education needs to be, especially climate education, needs to be woven into that fabric of education. Because it doesn't only affect scientists, it doesn't only affect the negotiators, it's affecting everybody. So when we do things like maths, instead of looking at how many fruits you have in a market stall, why don't we look at how many trees are being cut down? Why don't we bring in the terms like deforestation and climate change into these things? So people are already sensitized to it at a very early age. One thing I could also say is that we, in our pursuit to educate Trinidad and Tobago, there's a need, a very, very drastic need for behavioral or cultural change. And one that, well, our current culture is influenced by one, our dependence on oil and gas. So when we go to companies and we speak to the older folks, they tend to just, they listen to us and they're like, okay, well, yeah. When we speak to youth, when I was 12, 13, 14, I knew nothing about climate change. I just knew that, oh, okay, the globe getting hotter. Now they're able to tell us about climate change. So clearly something is happening, but the education needs to be more consistent and needs to be there and it needs to keep happening. So I'll just speak about one program that we are really proud to implement, well, proud to be implementing because it's going to be launched next year. And I think that this is something that every country should implement. And the name of it is the Youth Climate Ambassadors Program. And it takes the form of a 1-week intensive climate training workshop. So what it aims to do is we're going to invite persons between the ages of 15 to 35 to apply to be a part of this program. And when they apply, we're going to do 1 week in Trinidad, 1 week in Tobago. And we're going to explore climate change topics across the board. We're going to look at climate justice, climate finance, climate adaptation, mitigation. And the aim of this is to really get people thinking from at a younger age. You know, if I had these opportunities, I think I would be in a much better place now, right? I'd be doing much greater things. I'd be more aware. And I just want to leave you all with this, you know, education is so important. For us to know what we have to do in just transition, for us to know what we have to do in mitigation, adaptation, for us to understand loss and damage, we need to have that education. And yeah, when done right, when done just, it's the most powerful tool. And yeah, I really look forward to seeing positive change. And it's cliche, but it's all we could hope for. As a small island developing state, looking at mitigation is, I mean, we're beyond that. We have to start looking at adaptation. We have to start looking at how to prevent these things because, I mean, it's already here. There's no more climate changes knocking on the door. Climate change is in the room. It's here with us. So I just really hope to see the support for SIDS, but also support amongst SIDS, because together we are very powerful.
Indeed, and definitely education is an important aspect of adaptation and resilience. You mentioned tokenism, youth tokenism, which is something that we have been trying to get away from. Any thoughts on how we can better support and equip youth to engage in youth-led climate action?
Yeah, oh gosh, and I don't think that I feel like I'm a token in this event, right? Because yeah, I definitely don't feel like that. Yeah. But no, just giving them an opportunity to, I mean, for these negotiations, some of these things are so technical, they don't even know where to begin negotiating, but even just having them as observers, having them be a part of these meetings, just to see how it is and to understand mentorship programs. I mean, climate analytics, I look up to you all so much. When I grow up, I want to be like you all. You know, giving them the opportunity to understand these things, I think is very important. And like that Youth Climate Ambassadors program, I think it would equip them in the best way possible. You know, they're going to go into university already understanding a lot of these concepts, and that could also help them pursue things that could put them into the right places, the right rooms to really effectuate greater action.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Ryan, I think we are known for operating in silos, but for us to really have a chance at addressing climate change, we need it to be integrated into all sectors. So again, from the media perspective, have you been seeing the integration of climate considerations in other forms of journalism?
So I think we're doing a lot better than we used to. I think now, let me take it from a macro standpoint down to a micro, right? So sort of covering it over the last few years, certainly a body like, let's just take a body like CARICOM. CARICOM now speaks as one voice at these conferences. I can't say that I used to cover it 10 years ago, but I've been told that it was much more individual back then. Let's just say something like, I don't know, Paris Agreement or before that, right? It used to be individual islands almost speaking individually. From what I understand and what I've seen over the last few years is that they actually come in caucus before COPs or before these major climate conferences. They have a common theme, they have a common messaging, and everybody sings from the same hymn sheet at COP. And you would have noticed that in Glasgow, you'd notice it in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then in Dubai again. Prime Minister Motley is very much on the same tune with President Ali. So from a macro level, I think we've gotten a lot better, sort of realizing finally that, if we don't do this together, as Riyadh was quite rightly saying, if we don't come together as not just Caribbean islands, but as an alliance of small island states, including our friends in the Pacific and some Latin American countries as well, we're pretty much doomed if we don't do it together. From a micro standpoint, a lot of education needs to take place to bring everybody together to understand that we're all fighting against the same challenge. We're all fighting against the same demon here. And I think that is where a lot of our work needs to be done. And I want to point back to our story I did with Ruana just before SIDS 4. And in that story, she was calling for particularly financing for civil society. If the financing isn't trickling down to civil society, which in essence is doing much of the work when it comes to climate change, particularly in our country, I guess, then we have a problem. Because the people who need it the most aren't getting it. And I think that is where, from where I sit, that I think is where we really need to, I think it's a little bit, I like your question, I think it's a little bit isolated. And I think if we could all become, we had more awareness drives, like particularly one the EMA is working on right now and will be launched next year. If we had more of those things, I think we would get that glue that is so critically needed to get everybody onto the same, wavelength.
Yes. I think the first part of this session, we focused a lot on the actions of governments and countries, but thank you for bringing in the role of civil society. Civil society continues to play a very pivotal role in climate action and also to some extent holding our leaders accountable. And you've brought out the important point of education. I think from today's discussion, education, finance, but also, increased ambition. These stand out as important points for us to think about going forward, going into COP29, as we remain hopeful that we can, in fact, make a dent or at least try to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So at this point, I want to open the floor for the audience to get involved. Any questions? I see we have a question.
It isn't a question. Good afternoon, all. And I really enjoyed Riyadh, of course, Mr. Bichu, but I also loved Sasha because of the topics. What interested me, Riyadh, is your educational program. I'm also seeing persons like me in the 70s, we enjoy learning so that when we stand up and the water running down our, it's not a second menopause. It's something to do with climate change.
Hi, again, still Shandell. I guess this might be the most relevant to Ryan. You kind of touched on it. Like, You see it happen with these conferences. They go make these big declarations, then nothing happens, and then they do nothing, and all these talk, and it's all press, media, and all this hype. So going into Baku, we know Azerbaijan is trying to boost their tourism. So how is this COP going to stay grounded in reality? How are countries and parties going to get there and not be like, oh my God, all these things are happening in Azerbaijan, all these other things, like focus on what's going on. I know they negotiate leading up to it, going up to it, but once they get there, somehow it's just like the hype, you can't deny it. So how do cops stay grounded in reality when you get there is my question. Thanks.
I think Dubai was a good playground for that one ahead of Baku, because I think Dubai, and I get your question, but because so many people wanted to go to Dubai, not purely because of COP, because it was Dubai. You know, it was this amazing city, and you know, everybody, it's very famous, and you know, everything that is associated with Dubai. Maybe, you know, Ruana and I were part of a conversation many months ago at Alliance of Rural Communities, where we were discussing something similar to this, about, yeah, and Derval, you were there too. Yeah, and, you know, and I was making the point that sometimes it feels like cops have become, you know, like, to use a reference, the World Cup, you know, this is a very highly commercialized, you know, it's where everybody wants to be, and, you know, it's where everybody wants to go, and it's the World Cup of climate change, if you want to call it that. But Ruana made some very good points that day, and she reinforced it earlier to Sachin's question, which is a common question, which is a frustrating question to many people. And she's right. At the end of the day, COP is not perfect, but it's the best process that we have. There is no other, if somebody else has a better process, you know, write to the UNFCCC, I'm sure they'll be happy to hear from you. But right now, COP is the best process that we have. And contrary to all of the negative news that you see about climate change, and it is all true, there are a lot of good things happening because of these meetings, because of what happened in Bonn, because of what happened in Dubai, because of what happened in Paris, because of what happened 28 years ago at the first COP. There are a lot of good things happening, and I think that we should not always. There was a really good article in The Economist the other day where the writer, I can't remember her name right now, but she took a completely different spin. Instead of writing about the doom and gloom of climate change, she actually wrote on some of the major milestones that the world actually reached because of COPs. I thought it was different from everything else that we wrote. So yeah, I think once we get there, Chandel, I think the people that matter, like the negotiators and the politicians, and to a greater extent, the media, I think they're all going to be focused, or at least I've seen in my experience at COPs, that they get down to business and the beach could be after.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And to Chandel's question, everybody wanted to go to Dubai. Nobody wants to go to Baku. Apples and oranges, right? But to the core of this really goes to this notion of participation. And what do we mean when we say, you know, we need to make these spaces more democratic and more representative, and we need to have more participation. And no country has gotten it right as yet. So the Dubai model was a all-comers type of model. It was glitz and glam and flash in the culture that they have there. And it was the largest COP ever, over 100,000 participants, right? Before that, the largest COP we'd ever had was in Paris, and there were 30,000 participants. And that was the largest, and that was in 2015, and that was an extraordinarily important COP. So I've been around long enough to know a time where I couldn't talk about COP in an audience like this. People would be like, what are you talking about? Nobody cares. So we've come a very long way, and it's not all a bad thing. It's not all a bad thing that we now have this as the World Cup of climate change, because at least people want to know, they're interested, and they care. So I think we have to take the good with the bad. I'm not sure what approach the Azeris will take, but we know that the venue is a lot smaller. We know that they cannot accommodate in terms of just the number of rooms that are available in and around. They cannot accommodate the type of crowd that was present in Dubai. So I don't think we will see another COP like that. But we wait to see what will happen. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christian, and I have two questions. First is there a country strategy for education? Now, I'm thinking of not just secondary school students or university students, but other stakeholders. For example, at the last meeting here, I saw someone from the Scouts, right? So even thinking about different organizations and what might that strategy look like, as one. And number two, are there efforts to think through how we might, as small island developing states, thrive in spite of what seems to be a foregone conclusion with temperature rises?
Rana.
Well, we don't have government representatives here. Poor Riyadh is probably the closest thing, working with a state organization. I don't think there is that comprehensive strategy in place, Christian. Certainly from the Climate Analytics Caribbean point of view, our mission has really been to try to reach as many people as possible with this type of information. At the end of the day, we are still operating in a very capacity-constrained environment. Even if you look at, the Multilateral Environments Agreement division in the Ministry of Planning, which is the division that is dealing with all multilateral environmental agreements, not just in climate change, they are severely understaffed. Right? And they are attending these conferences as well as making the policies, as well as trying to implement the policies, as well as fundraising, as well as. So we are not in a position right now, I think, to have the kind of comprehensive climate education that we need to have, and which is also set out under the original convention in Article 6, under the Paris Agreement in Article 12. The work that Riyadh is doing in the ACE program is a part of that. So at the multilateral level, there is that recognition of the importance of capacity building and education on climate change. But we come back to the fundamental question, where is the money? And there is no money for it being available internationally. And back to what Ryan has said, for the most part, from a small island developing state perspective, even when we talk about finance, even where we have some access to finance, and it's very small amounts compared to the needs, that access isn't trickling down to civil society necessarily. And if it is, it's, again, very small amounts. So you have to do project here, project there, project there. You have to try to have a global vision in your head, which me and my entire team try to have at all times, a global vision in your head of, okay, this is the macro vision, and we have this small pot here, this small pot here, this small pot here, this small pot here, and this is how we'll bring it together. So it doesn't exist yet, but I hope it will come. In terms of resilience building and resilience planning, I know that there's a lot of work underway to design a national adaptation policy. There's a lot of individual projects happening right now on adaptation, on flooding specifically. Even as Climate Analytics, we're involved in some work on flooding, looking at doing mapping in particular flood basins within Trinidad and Tobago, for the use of a tool that could help us to plan better for those types of events. But again, this comes back to that the implementation of that global goal and adaptation framework that Sasha was speaking to, the indicators that are put in place, and then the financing that is made available to help countries with adaptation and resilience building. And that's why this finance year and this finance COP is so important, and what Ambassador Felson spoke about in terms of SID's specific lens on that climate finance goal is so important, because SIDs are speaking about the need for having the money available for adaptation, for resilience, for loss and damage, in particular, because of what we know is already happening and what is coming. Even if we stay within a 1.5-degree trajectory, we will suffer more loss and damage. That is a fact.
I just wanted to add real quick, just on your last point with us thriving in spite of the challenges. I feel sometimes some Caribbean people think that we throw our hands up in the air and, you know, we're the victims of climate change and we're not doing anything. I think we have some of the most resilient people in the world. In fact, I would jump out myself and I would say that in some parts, I just think we are such a beacon of hope for how people are going to have to live in the future. I think we are. I think we have brilliant people. Just forget the practical side. There's a really good documentary that Climate Analytics Caribbean did that really showcases, to an extent, the resiliency of Caribbean, but also on the human capital side. We have, and I'm not just calling Ruana because Ruana is on stage, but we have people like Ruana Haynes, we have people like Kishan Kumar Singh, we had Mr. Seeley, God rest his soul, from Barbados, who's now passed on. The human beings that we have on the world stage representing us are second to none. And so we are thriving. What we need is we need access to resources and we need the access to climate finance to push that even further along and further ahead. So, you know, I just wanted to say that because I feel like some Caribbean people feel like when Ruana goes to COP and Kishan goes, yeah, it's quite the opposite. We have really good people. Just as the United States and China and India have really strong people leading their agenda, we have really good people leading our agenda. And I just wanted to always hit brakes when people, just not to make people feel that we're the victims here. We actually doing a pretty damn good job in the Caribbean.
Hello, everybody. Good night. Firstly, I just want to say congratulations on the launch of that program next year. That's amazing. That's a really good initiative. My colleague and I were actually discussing that it reminds us of the Environmental Ambassador Program. So great. What is the EMA and potentially, I guess, the media doing to provoke change at the Ministry of Education to basically ensure that this curriculum is implemented in our schools, and also as a whole society, they approach education on climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, no. So it is a reinvention of that Youth Ambassadors program, but it was discontinued roughly 10 years ago. And the reinvention was just based off of the fact that climate change is the big ticket item and it really needs to reach everybody. We have an entire public education unit that is dedicated to, well, very limited in capacity. I could count the amount of members on one hand, but very dedicated to educating all stakeholders across Trinidad and Tobago. And we do that through outreach, lectures, presentations, almost every other day. But we also have programs that aim to educate them as well. So, for example, through the Ministry of Education, we did anti-Alisa comprehension activity. So during COVID time, they were looking for different ways to educate the kids because, of course, they were acclimatized into this whole online system. And they reached out to the EMA, and we actually developed a comprehension activity, which we launched this year. So that's just one example. They also reached out to us to revamp the Form 3 integrated science curriculum and to really include climate change. So it's something that I was working on as well. So those are just two ways that we work with the Ministry of Education. We also have an Enviro Clubs program. So through that program, we invite primary schools and secondary schools to create an Enviro Club. So we go to the schools, we have a introductory session, we give them advice on how to set it up, and 6 months down the line, we go back, check in with them, and once they really get things started, we bring them onto the Enviro Club program. And every term, we actually share activities with them. And we don't, EMA alone doesn't do that. We reach out to other organizations to find ways to engage the students. So we're actually partnering with a NGO right now. And we did a road show where we were going to different schools and actually teaching them about the marine environment, the Maritime Ocean Collective. It's a species project. Yeah, so that's something that we are doing as well. And I mean, we're trying our best because again, very limited capacity. But yeah, we're very, very dedicated to really educating everyone, both in Trinidad and Tobago. Not just the youths, but we go to organizations, different levels, oil and gas companies too, to educate them about the environment. So the education is happening. It just needs to be more consistent, and so that we could get that change and get that education going.
So I think we have time for two more questions. So Sasha.
Hello. Oh, sorry. So this is not a question. I would say this would be a comment just based on the questions here on the importance of education and behavioral change in Trinidad and Tobago, especially on climate action, and not just only for youth, but it has to be it's a whole of society behavioral change approach that we need from children all the way up to retirees and elderly people, because they need to be aware of what is happening in terms of climate change. And I think we have, so my background is in engineering, so I'm very focused on solutions, right? And we have an opportunity in 2025 where countries have to submit their updated NDCs, NDC 3.0. And this is where we could actually say, this is what we want this is what our climate actions for Trinidad and Tobago could be. And it has to be participatory, it has to be inclusive, and it has to outline, these are our key actions, these are our key outcomes, and this is how we want to do it. And climate education and having this sort of strategy can be part of it, because that will inform everything else, if it is on mitigation, if it is on just transition, on loss and damage. So that can be part of it. So what I would say is that you all here have to be part of that discussion on how we go about, developing our more ambitious, updated NDCs in 2025. And I think that is one way to do it. You all, instead of us saying what can we do and we cannot be involved, that is actually one avenue that everybody could be part of, right? So I'm just letting you all know that. And then also, I just also wanted to let you all know that Trinidad and Tobago submitted its National Adaptation Plan at the SBs in June. It is available on the UNFCCC website. Definitely take a look at it. Definitely ensure that, government and stakeholders are held accountable for the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan. I think it's quite important for everybody to read it and to be aware of it and to know what's going on in it. It's been, I would say, a labor of love for people involved in developing the plan. It's quite comprehensive. And I think what the whole point of that National Adaptation Plan is, it's not just supposed to be a document. It has to be implemented and it has to be useful for all. So just those 2 points. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha, for admonishing us to become more informed and involved in climate action.
Okay, good evening. My name is Alicia. I have one just brief question. You mentioned lastly, and I'm hearing it throughout the entire seminar. Well, my mind initially went to how do we provide that information for you? Is there an outreach program that you guys have, or a volunteer program that we can come and offer some services? Even state agencies would have some level of information, support, or persons who you can't procure, but we could offer some kind of services. Is there any program one, is there any program that exists where we could come and volunteer services? And two, exactly how do we help to provide that information to you guys?
Thanks for the question. Well, when Sasha was talking about providing the information, I think she was talking about the government when they are doing their stakeholder consultation process. They normally send out information that they are having a consultation on a particular policy. We hope that in the context of preparing the new nationally determined contribution, that they will also undertake a stakeholder process, which I think we can probably work with them to help to spread the word that it's happening, to make sure that everyone who needs to be at the table and consulted is consulted on it. In terms of climate analytics, we don't have a volunteer program at this time. I'm very much a stickler for if people are working with us, we have to pay them. I do not believe in the European volunteer model, sorry. But we do have a number of events where we try to get people involved in the conversation, and we will have a number upcoming, including in relation to energy and renewable energy. In particular, that might be quite interesting. So please do follow our socials, LinkedIn, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, to stay updated on what's happening. And there will be opportunities for you to engage with us directly on, several different projects that we have in the pipeline. So do look forward to that. But we do also have vacancies from time to time, so you could also watch that space if you want to work with us. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Rana. So if there are no burning questions, I will now invite Rana to help us wrap the session with some closing reflections.
Right. I promise I will be hopeful this time. No, honestly, I struggled a little bit with what I was going to say in the opening because, even for somebody who has been involved in a diplomatic process for as long as I have, I do have trouble not saying how I really feel. And so what you all got in the opening is how I really feel. With that said, I think we've heard a lot this evening that gives us a reason for hope. Riyadh, I hear from youth a lot this frustration around feeling, as if they've been tokenized. And I understand the frustration completely. But for me, somebody who is a little older and a little more jaded, it's really important to have youth involved. It's really, really important because the youth always give me as an individual hope. The hope that I need to continue doing what we do. And it's a role that I think cannot be overlooked. From the perspective of the youth, I mean, you have no choice. This is your future. And you want to believe that you will be able to have a viable future, right? And to enjoy the things that those who came before also enjoyed. So you have to be hopeful. And so for the rest of us who have been around a little longer, it's important to be able to share in that hope. And so let me leave you guys with a few hopeful factoids to go forward with. So when we started the discussion, I had mentioned that the Paris Agreement had bent the emissions curve significantly. One of the major milestones that we need to hit in order to keep that 1.5 degrees limit alive and within reach is to peak global emissions before 2025. Climate Analytics, the broader global organization, we're putting together some studies now that show that it is very likely that we will peak by 2025. The issue will be maintaining that and not going back up again afterwards. But the issue will be making sure that we continue to have a steep decline after the peak. But it is likely that we will peak, and that will be extremely good news once it can be confirmed. We are also in the process of looking forward to new NDCs. NDC 3.0 is what they're calling it, these nationally determined contributions that set out, what countries will do in order to address climate change, their mitigation adaptation actions. And it is very likely that some of the largest emitters will come forward with extremely ambitious NDCs this year. We look forward to good NDCs from the likes of Brazil, which would be important, even from the likes of China, which would be extremely important. And once we have these ambitious NDCs, they will send a really clear signal that climate action and the need for ambitious action is in fact irreversible. It will send a signal for the momentum that we will need for the rest of this critical decade. When we look at the facts and figures around renewable energy and we break down that global pledge to triple renewable energy, Climate Analytics has done a study looking at what needs to happen in each region, each of the 5 UN regions around that goal. And for many regions, this goal, those sub-goals will be met. For some of them, they are close to being met. It is likely that they will meet it once the relevant financing is in place. So there are glimmers of hope on the horizon. There are still questions about whether we will get there fast enough, because at this point, we need to be looking at a very rapid transformation and not an incremental one. But there's always reason for hope, especially with the youth pushing us to do what needs to be done. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all so very much for coming out. We do have light refreshments and drinks. Please stay and socialize. Thank you.